February 1889. The rails had been buried for 9 weeks, and the town of Deerfield, Oregon was learning what it meant to be forgotten. The supply train that was supposed to arrive on December 3rd had not arrived. The one scheduled for December 17th had not arrived. The emergency shipment that the territorial governor had promised in January had not arrived either because the Cascade passes were choked with snow, 30 feet deep, and the locomotives that were supposed to clear them sat frozen on sidings 100 miles to the west. As useless as the promises of politicians, Deerfield had 260 souls, a general store with empty shelves, and a growing understanding that the civilization they had trusted to sustain them had simply stopped. The hunger announced itself in stages. First the flour ran out, then the salt pork, then the cornmeal and the dried beans and the tinned goods that Aldrich Prentice had stocked in his mercantile at prices that had always been too high and were now entirely theoretical because there was nothing left to sell at any price. Children grew thin. The elderly grew quiet. A particular silence settled over the town, the silence of people conserving their energy because they did not know when they would eat again. But in a cabin on the hillside east of town where the morning sun struck first and lingered longest, a woman named Lenora Hestwood opened the door to her drying shed and surveyed her harvest. She was 62 years old. Her hands were rough from 3 years of labor, her back bent slightly from decades of work that had started long before she ever came to this place. Her hair, once the color of autumn wheat, had gone entirely silver, but her eyes remained sharp, clear, the eyes of a woman who had learned to see what others refused to look at. The shelves that lined the walls from floor to ceiling held what no store in Deerfield could offer: 512 pounds of dried fruit packed in cloth sacks and sealed wooden boxes organized by type and date, apples sliced thin as paper and dried to supple leather, pears halved and honeyed before drying, their sweetness concentrated to an intensity that made the tongue ache, plums transformed into dense dark prunes that held the memory of summer in every wrinkled fold, cherries both sweet and sour reduced to jewel-like morsels that could sustain a grown man through a day of labor on a handful, blackberries and huckleberries dried on screens until they rattled like tiny stones, each one a capsule of nourishment. 512 pounds. 3 years of patient labor mocked every step of the way. Lenora closed the shed door, pulled her shawl tight against the cold, and walked to the stable where her sorrel mare Maple stood chewing hay with the placid contentment of a horse whose owner had planned ahead. She pressed her forehead against the mare's warm neck and allowed herself one moment of weariness before the work began. "Well, old girl," she said, "I suppose they'll be coming round soon." The words hung in the cold air. Maple snorted softly and continued chewing. They had said the fruit would rot. They had been wrong. The story of how Lenora Hestwood came to Deerfield began with a falling tree and a dying man's last words. Spring of 1885. The logging camps along the Willamette River were finishing their season, the men exhausted from months of dangerous work, the accident rates climbing as fatigue set in. Ezra Hestwood had worked the timber for 37 years, starting as a boy of 16 and working his way up to crew foreman. He knew the forest better than he knew the rooms of his own house. He could read a tree the way a scholar reads a book, understanding its lean, its weight, its hidden rot, the way it would fall. But even the best readers sometimes miss a word. The Douglas fir that killed him was 200 feet tall and 6 feet across at the base. It should have fallen clean to the north toward the clearing where the skid road waited. Instead, it twisted, a hidden weakness in the grain, invisible until the saw had cut too deep to stop. The tree groaned, shuddered, and came down at an angle that no one had predicted. Ezra saw it coming. He had perhaps 3 seconds to react, and he used those seconds not to save himself, but to shove young Patrick Doherty out of the path. Patrick lived. Ezra did not. The tree caught him across the chest, pinning him to the forest floor, crushing his ribs, destroying his lungs. He lived for 11 minutes after the accident, long enough for Lenora to be summoned from the camp kitchen where she had been preparing the noon meal, long enough for her to kneel beside him in the sawdust, in the blood, and the scattered needles of the tree that had killed him, long enough for him to say the words that would change everything. Lenora. His voice was a whisper, wet with the blood filling his lungs. "I'm here, Ezra. I'm here." The tree. A pause, a struggle for breath that would not come. "Forgive the tree." She thought she had misheard him. the chaos around them, the shouting men, the creak of the timber still settling. What? Forgive the tree, it didn't mean to fall that way. His eyes found hers, held them. Promise me. Ezra, I don't. Promise, she promised. He died with her hand in his blood soaking into the knees of her work dress, his last breath a sound she would hear in her nightmares for months afterward. The logging company sent a foreman to her cabin 3 days later. A man named Garrett, thick-necked and uncomfortable, who delivered an envelope containing $200 in an expression suggesting he hoped she would not make trouble. She did not make trouble. She made plans. Lenora Hestwood was not a woman given to despair. This was not because she had lived an easy life. It was precisely because she had not. She had buried 2 children before they reached their first year. She had survived a fever that killed half her village when she was 17. She had watched her mother die slowly from a cancer that ate her from the inside out, spending 3 years nursing the woman who had given her life, learning in those final months every secret of preservation and preparation that Constance Hestwood had carried in her memory. Lenora had learned that grief was not a destination. It was a road, and the only way to survive it was to keep walking. In the weeks after Ezra's death, she walked. She walked the forest where he had worked, standing beneath trees that towered above her, like the columns of some vast cathedral. She walked the riverbanks where they had fished together in the early years of their marriage, before the logging work consumed him entirely. She walked the perimeter of the camp past the bunkhouses and the cookhouse and the company store, watching the men who had been her husband's brothers in labor go about their work with the subdued efficiency of those who have been reminded of their own mortality. And she thought, the $200 was more money than she had ever possessed at one time, enough to buy passage anywhere, enough to start over in Portland or San Francisco, to find work as a cook or a seamstress or a housekeeper in some wealthy family's home, enough to live quietly for a year or two while she figured out what came next. But Lenora was 62 years old. She had no children living, no family to speak of, no connections that would ease her way into a new life. She had only herself, her skills, and a choice. She could spend the money on comfort, on a slow, comfortable decline into old age independence, or she could spend it on purpose. The idea came to her gradually over the course of long walks and longer nights, crystallizing slowly like ice forming on a winter pond. She remembered the stories her mother had told about the early days in the Willamette Valley, when the orchards were young and the fruit came in quantities that staggered the imagination. She remembered the drying racks that had filled her childhood home every autumn, the sweet smell of preserving fruit, the satisfaction of watching the cellar fill with provisions that would sustain the family through any winter. She remembered, too, the waste she had seen in her travels with Ezra. The abandoned orchards left behind by settlers who had moved on or died out, their trees still producing abundantly each autumn, their fruit falling ungathered to rot on the ground. The wild plum thickets and berry brambles that choked every fence line, and forgotten homestead, their bounty ignored by people who had grown accustomed to buying their provisions from stores. The land was drowning in fruit that nobody valued. Lenora valued it. She began to study maps. Deerfield appeared on the territorial survey as a small dot in the eastern foothills of the Cascade Range, connected to the wider world by a single rail line that wound through the mountains from Portland. It had been founded 12 years earlier by a group of settlers who had come for the timber, stayed for the mild climate, and prospered modestly on the logging and milling trade. The town sat in a valley surrounded by forested hills, the kind of country where wild fruit grew abundantly in every clearing and abandoned pasture. The elevation was high enough to produce cold winters, but low enough to escape the worst of the mountain snowfall. The eastern slopes caught the morning sun and held it through the afternoon, creating conditions that were ideal for drying. Lenore arrived in Deerfield in September of 1885, traveling alone on the supply train that made its twice-monthly run from Portland. She was 62 years old. She carried a single trunk containing her clothes, her mother's recipe book, and the tools of her trade, a set of carbon steel knives worn thin from decades of sharpening, a collection of cheesecloth screens in various sizes, and a small leather case containing thermometers and hydrometers for measuring temperature and humidity. She also carried $200 in an envelope sewn into her corset and a plan. The land agent in Deerfield was a young man named Prescott, barely 30, who regarded her with the poorly concealed skepticism that young men often showed toward older women with unconventional requests. You want to buy the Hendricks parcel, he repeated as if she might have misspoken. That's correct. Ma'am, that land is, well, it's not exactly prime property. Steep hillside, rocky soil, no water access except the creek at the bottom of the draw. It's not suitable for farming or grazing or much of anything else. How much? Prescott blinked. $30 for 5 acres. But ma'am, I really think you should consider. I'll take it. She paid cash, signed the papers, and walked out of the land office with a deed to property that Prescott had been trying to sell for 3 years. That afternoon, she climbed the hill to see what she had purchased. The land was everything Prescott had described and more. The slope was steep enough to make walking difficult. The soil was thin over a bed of fractite rock, and the only flat ground was a small shelf near the top where some previous owner had cleared the trees and given up on whatever they had intended to build. But the slope faced east. The morning sun would strike this hillside first and linger longest, warming the air and drying the dew before the valley below had fully awakened. The afternoon breeze flowing up from the creek bottom would sweep across the shelf, reliably carrying away moisture and keeping the air fresh. Lenora stood on that shelf and looked down at the valley below. She could see Deerfield spread out beneath her. The main street with its general store and saloon and livery stable. The church with its white steeple. The scattered houses and barns and outbuildings of a town that had grown just large enough to believe itself permanent. Beyond the town, she could see the wild country stretching toward the mountains. Hillsides covered with forest clearings, dotted with the pink and white of wild fruit trees in their autumn colors. Brambles dark with berries along every fence line and stream bank. She saw abundance. She saw waste. She saw opportunity. This will do, she said to no one but herself and the wind. Lenora built her drying shed first. This decision would later be cited as the first evidence of her madness. What kind of woman built a shed before she built a place to live? What kind of woman spent 3 weeks constructing a building for storing fruit while sleeping in a canvas tent on a rocky hillside with winter approaching? The kind of woman who understood priorities. The kind of woman who knew that shelter could be improvised, but infrastructure could not. The kind of woman whose mother had taught her that the difference between surviving a hard winter and dying in one often came down to what you had stored in your cellar. The drying shed was a long, narrow structure 24 feet by 10, with slatted walls that allowed air to circulate freely, and a roof of cedar shakes that kept the rain off without trapping moisture. She hired 2 men from town to help with the heavy lifting, paying them in cash, and enduring their puzzled glances without explanation. Inside, she installed wooden racks at 3 levels, waist height, shoulder height, and overhead. Each level was fitted with frames of cheesecloth stretched taut over pine borders. The frames could slide in and out like drawers, allowing her to load and unload fruit without disturbing the pieces already drying. At one end, she built a small stone hearth connected to a clay-lined flue that would provide supplemental heat on wet autumn days when the sun alone could not finish the job. She had learned from her mother that gentle heat and steady airflow were the secrets. Too much heat cooked the fruit rather than drying it, destroying the very nutrients that made preserved fruit worth eating. The cabin came second. It was modest. 1 room, a sleeping loft, a fieldstone hearth, and a covered porch where she could sit in the evenings and watch the valley below. Maple had a lean-to stable attached to the cabin's north wall, snug and dry. The total cost of land shed and cabin came to $74. She had $126 remaining. Enough to survive for a year while she built her stores. Enough to prove what she had come here to prove. The first harvest season in Deerfield taught Lenora that she had been right about everything except the scale. She had expected abundance. She had not expected surfeit. The wild plum thickets along the creek bottoms produced fruit in quantities that would have supplied a commercial operation. The abandoned orchards scattered through the hills yielded apples and pears by the wagon load. The huckleberry meadows on the high slopes were carpeted with berries so thick that walking through them left purple stains on her boots and the hem of her dress. She worked from dawn until dark 7 days a week, filling baskets that Maple hauled up the hill on a wooden sledge. Her hands were stained purple and brown for weeks at a time. Her back ached constantly. Her knees protested the steep climb up and down the hillside. She did not complain. She did not rest. She harvested. The drying process was an art refined over 3 generations. Each fruit required different treatment. Apples were cored, peeled, and sliced to a 1/4 inch thickness. She dipped them briefly in salted water to prevent browning, then laid them on the frames in single layers that did not touch. At ideal temperature and humidity, they would dry in 3 to 4 days, transforming from crisp slices into supple leather that could be chewed for hours, releasing sweetness with every bite. Pears were halved, their cores scooped out with a curved knife her grandmother had brought from Tennessee. Before drying, she brushed them with a thin honey wash that enhanced their natural sweetness and gave the finished fruit a golden sheen. Pears took longer than apples, sometimes a full week, but the result was worth the wait. Plums were halved and pitted, laid cut side up on the frames to let the moisture escape gradually. The transformation from fresh plum to finished prune was almost alchemical, the fruit shrinking to a third of its original size, while concentrating its sugars and flavors into something far more intense than the original. Cherries were the most delicate work. She left them whole stems removed and dried them slowly at the lowest possible temperature to preserve their shape and color. A single puncture in the skin would cause the cherry to shrivel unevenly, ruining its appearance, if not its taste. Berries were spread on fine mesh screens, stirred gently twice a day, to ensure even drying, then pressed into dense cakes wrapped in wax cloth. These berry cakes were her mother's innovation trail food that weighed almost nothing but packed extraordinary nourishment. By late October, Lenora had processed 40 pounds of dried apple rings. She carried a sample down to Deerfield to see if anyone might want to buy them. Aldrich Prentice was the commercial heart of Deerfield. He was a stout man in his 50s, with a red beard going gray at the edges, and small, shrewd eyes that missed nothing that might affect his profit margins. He had come to Deerfield 8 years earlier with a wagon full of goods and an understanding of frontier economics that had served him well ever since. Everything came through Prentice. Flour, sugar, coffee, tools, fabric, medicine. He set the prices. He extended the credit. He decided who prospered and who struggled. His store was the only game in town, and he made certain that everyone understood this. A woman selling dried fruit from a hillside shed was at best an irrelevance, at worst a nuisance. He examined Lenora's apple rings with theatrical disdain, holding one up to the light, sniffing it, bending it between his thick fingers. "Dried fruit," he said flatly. "You want me to sell dried fruit?" "I want to sell it myself," Lenora corrected. "I was hoping to set up a table outside your store on market days." Prentice's small eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Hestwood, I stock everything this town needs, including dried fruit, when the supply train brings it from Portland. Proper dried fruit processed by proper companies in proper packaging. What you have here is," he gestured dismissively, "homemade." "It's high-quality homemade," Lenora said mildly. "People want what they know. They want labels and brands, not something cooked up in a shed by a widow with time on her hands." "It isn't cooked," Lenora said. "It's dried. There's a considerable difference." "The answer is no, Mrs. Hestwood. You may not set up outside my store. It would give the wrong impression." Lenora looked at him for a long moment. She saw the calculation behind his eyes, the quick assessment of threat and opportunity that governed all his interactions. She understood that this was not about quality or propriety. It was about control. "I see," she said. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Prentice." She collected her sample and left. The wrong impression, Lenora learned, was one that several prominent citizens of Deerfield shared. Cornelius Boggs owned the lumber mill that employed half the town's working men. He was a large man with a booming voice and a laugh that could be heard 3 blocks away, the kind of man who had never known real hardship and therefore found it easy to mock those who prepared for it. At the saloon that evening, word of Lenora's visit to Prentice's store had already spread. "Dried fruit," Boggs repeated, his voice carrying across the room. "The widow wants to sell dried fruit. 500 pounds of it, supposedly," someone offered. "That's what Prentice says. She's got a whole shed full." Boggs laughed until his eyes watered. 500 pounds. What does she think is going to happen? A plague of locusts? Does she imagine the supply train is going to stop running? The men around him laughed along. "Perhaps she means to open a shop," Boggs wheezed. "Hestwood's dried goods, specializing in madness by the pound." More laughter. "She's touched," someone said. "Grief does that to some women. Losing her husband, coming out here alone at her age. It's sad, really." "Sad," Boggs agreed, wiping his eyes. "Sad and entirely mad." The mockery did not stop at the saloon. Lucretia Boggs, wife of Cornelius, was the social center of Deerfield's respectable women. What she approved, the town approved. What she condemned, the town condemned, and she had decided to condemn Lenora Hestwood. She organized a women's auxiliary meeting at the church to discuss the matter, gathering the wives of the town's prominent men in the pews where they usually gathered to pray. The poor creature has clearly been affected by her husband's passing, Lucretia announced to the assembled women, living alone on that hillside, spending all her time in that shed drying fruit by the hundreds of pounds. It borders on mania. The women murmured agreement. And the conditions, Lucretia continued. I've heard from reliable sources that the shed is open to the air. Birds and insects have free access. The sanitary implications alone should concern us all. More murmuring. She means well, I'm sure, Lucretia concluded, but I feel it is our Christian duty to discourage this enterprise. For her own good, of course. No respectable woman should be seen purchasing fruit dried in such unsavory conditions. The resolution was unanimous. The women of Deerfield would not purchase Lenora Hestwood's dried fruit. They would furthermore spread word of the unsavory conditions to anyone who might be tempted. For her own good, of course, Aldrich Prentice heard about the women's meeting and saw an opportunity. The widow's dried fruit operation was small, almost certainly temporary, and posed no real threat to his business. But Prentice had not built his commercial empire by waiting for threats to become real. He had built it by eliminating potential competition before it could take root. He began spreading rumors. Nothing too specific, nothing that could be traced back to him directly. Just casual comments dropped in conversation, questions raised about hygiene and quality, suggestions that the widow might not be entirely stable. I hear she talks to her horse, he mentioned to one customer. Spends hours in that shed muttering to herself. The grief, you know, it affects people in strange ways. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with rare fruit, he told another. I'm just saying, do you really know what's in it? She's up there alone, no one watching, no standards to meet. Who knows what might end up in those apple rings? The seeds he planted took root quickly. Within weeks, Lenora's drying shed had acquired a name, the Madhouse. People spoke it with a mixture of pity and amusement, shaking their heads at the foolishness of a widow who had lost her way. Children were warned to stay away from the crazy woman's hillside. Men making deliveries to the upper valley would detour around her property rather than pass close to her cabin. The fruit she had hoped to sell remained in her storage cellar untouched by commerce. No one wanted to buy from the Madhouse. Lenora heard it all. The mockery reached her through 100 small channels. The delivery man who refused to meet her eyes. The women who crossed the street when they saw her coming. The children who whispered and pointed when she passed. She heard the name they had given her shed. She understood what it meant, and she continued her work. This was not because she lacked feelings. It was not because the cruelty did not wound her. There were nights when she lay in her sleeping loft and felt the full weight of her isolation, the terrible loneliness of being a woman without family or friends in a town that had decided to despise her. But Lenora Hestwood was 62 years old. She had buried a husband and 2 children. She had nursed her mother through a death that had taken 3 years to complete. She had survived things that would have broken a weaker woman, and she had survived them by understanding a simple truth. Other people's opinions were just weather. You could not control weather. You could not argue with it or reason with it or convince it to change its mind. You could only prepare for it, wait for it to pass, and continue doing what needed to be done. The mockery was weather. Lenora prepared for harder things. Through 1886 and 1887, she expanded her operation. She planted 4 apple trees and 3 pear trees on her hillside saplings that would take years to bear, but that represented an investment in the future. She cultivated blackberry canes along her fence line, training them on trellises that maximized sun exposure and made harvesting easier. She established a relationship with 2 families who lived higher up the valley, trading finished dried fruit for access to their wild huckleberry patches. Her methods grew more sophisticated. She experimented with different drying times and temperatures, keeping careful notes in a leather-bound journal that her mother had given her decades ago. She discovered that plums dried at a slightly lower heat for a longer period produced prunes of superior texture and flavor. She learned that cherries dried over the stone hearth on rainy days, with the door cracked for ventilation, retained more color than those dried in full sun. She developed a method for pressing dried berries into dense cakes that could be wrapped in wax cloth and stored indefinitely. These cakes were her proudest innovation, an improvement on even her mother's technique. A single cake the size of a man's palm contained enough nourishment for a day of labor. Trail food that weighed almost nothing but could sustain life through the hardest conditions. She also learned to store her harvest properly. The drying shed was for processing. For storage, she built a separate structure, a cool, dark room dug into the hillside behind her cabin, lined with cedar planks to repel insects and moisture. The dried fruit went into cloth sacks inside sealed wooden boxes, each one labeled with the contents and the date of preparation. She kept a ledger recording every pound processed, every pound consumed, every pound remaining. By the autumn of 1888, her ledger showed a reserve of 512 pounds. 512 pounds. It was an extraordinary quantity, more than one woman and one horse could eat in 5 years. More than any reasonable assessment of personal need could justify. The people of Deerfield, who had been mocking her for 3 years, pointed to this surplus as final proof of her derangement. 500 pounds of dried fruit, Aldrich Prentice reported at his store, shaking his head in wonderment. The woman has lost her mind entirely. Who needs 500 pounds of fruit? She'll be buried in prunes before she's buried in the ground. Cornelius Boggs laughed until his eyes watered. Perhaps she means to open a shop, his wife added, her voice dripping with false concern. Poor creature. Someone should speak to the pastor about arranging some kind of intervention. The consensus in Deerfield was unanimous. Lenora Hestwood had gone mad. Her shed full of dried fruit was the proof. No rational person would spend 3 years preparing for a disaster that would never come. Lenora heard it all. She heard the laughter and the pity and the contempt. She heard the name they called her shed. She heard the predictions that she would die alone on her hillside, surrounded by fruit that would rot because there was no one to eat it. And she said nothing. She simply added another 20 pounds of dried pear to her stores and continued her work. Because Lenora Hestwood understood something that the people of Deerfield did not. She understood that summer does not last. She understood that trains do not always run. She understood that the only provision you can truly depend upon is the one you make with your own hands. And she understood that the autumn of 1888 it was different. The rains came early that year. September brought storms that usually did not arrive until November, soaking the mountain passes, saturating the railbeds, turning the crude roads that connected Deerfield to the wider world into rivers of mud. Lenora stood on her porch and watched the clouds building over the Cascades. She felt the change in the air, the particular quality of cold that preceded a hard winter. She remembered her mother pointing to similar skies in the Willamette Valley decades ago, saying words that had stayed with her ever since. When the rains come early, the snows come heavy, and when the snows come heavy, the hungry times follow. Lenora looked at the clouds. She looked at her drying shed. She looked at the valley below where the people of Deerfield were going about their business without a care in the world, trusting in the supply train, trusting in the railroad schedule printed in Portland by men who had never spent a winter in the mountains. They don't see it, she said to Maple, who stood beside her, chewing contentedly on a windfall apple. They don't see what's coming. Maple snorted. No, Lenora agreed. I don't suppose they would listen, even if I told them. She turned away from the view and walked toward the wild plum thickets by the creek. There was still time. There was still fruit on the trees. There was still work to be done. The autumn of 1888 was the hardest harvest of Lenora's life. She was 65 years old now, and the years had begun to take their toll. Her knees ached constantly. Her hands, once so nimble, had grown stiff and slow. Her back protested every bend and lift. And there were mornings when she wondered if she could make it down the hillside to the orchards, let alone back up again, with baskets full of fruit. But the clouds kept building over the mountains. And the feeling in her bones, the knowledge that her mother had passed down along with the recipes and techniques, kept telling her that this winter would be different. So she worked. She worked through September and October and into November, waiting against the weather, harvesting every piece of fruit she could find. She stripped the wild plum thickets bare. She climbed the huckleberry meadows one last time, filling baskets until her shoulders screamed. She visited the abandoned orchards and gathered windfall apples by the wagon loads, sorting through them by lantern, light cutting away the bad spots, slicing and drying the rest. The people of Deerfield saw her working. They shook their heads. The old woman's finally cracked, they said, harvesting like there's no tomorrow, working herself to death for fruit that nobody wants. Leave her alone, some said. She's harmless, just a bit touched in the head. Someone should really do something, and others said. It's not Christian to let her go on like this. But no one did anything. No one offered to help. No one thought to ask why a woman who had lived through 65 winters might be working so hard to prepare for this one. The supply train arrived on November 15th. It was the last train of the season, though no one knew it at the time. Aldrich Prentice placed his usual order: flour, sugar, coffee, salt, pork, tinned goods, all the staples that Deerfield depended on to survive the winter months. But he ordered less than usual. The autumn harvest had been good. Money was tight. And besides, the train would be back in 2 weeks with another shipment. It always came back. Why would this year be any different? The train pulled out of Deerfield on November 16th, heading west through the passes toward Portland. It never returned. On the hillside above town, Lenora Hestwood sealed the last of her storage boxes and updated her ledger. 512 pounds of dried fruit, enough to feed a family of 4 for 2 years. Enough to sustain a woman and a horse through any winter, no matter how long. Enough perhaps for other purposes that she did not yet want to consider. She closed the ledger and walked out onto her porch. Below her, Deerfield was settling in for winter, smoke rising from chimneys, lamplight glowing in windows, the ordinary rhythms of a town that believed itself safe. Above her, the first snowflakes of the season were beginning to fall. They fell gently at first. They would not fall gently for long. The snow began falling on November 17th, and it did not stop for 11 days. Not the gentle flurries that Deerfield knew from ordinary winters. Not the picturesque dustings that made the valley look like a scene from a Christmas card. This was something different, something older, something that belonged to a time before railroads and supply trains and the comfortable assumption that civilization would always provide. The snow fell in sheets so thick that a man could not see his neighbor's house from his own front porch. It fell with a weight that collapsed the roof of Henderson's chicken coop on the 3rd day and brought down the awning over Prentice's mercantile on the 5th. It fell with a silence that seemed to swallow all other sounds, muffling the town in a white blanket that grew deeper by the hour. By the end of November, the drifts in the valley floor measured 8 feet deep. In the mountain passes where the wind drove the snow into massive accumulations, against every obstruction, the drifts measured 30 feet and more. The railroad tracks disappeared. They did not merely become covered. They ceased to exist as a meaningful feature of the landscape, buried so completely that the survey markers themselves vanished beneath the white. The locomotives that were supposed to clear the passes sat frozen on sidings in Portland, their boilers cold, their crews standing idle, their schedules rendered meaningless by a winter that had not consulted the railway company's timetables. The supply train that was supposed to arrive on December 3rd did not arrive. No one in Deerfield was particularly concerned. Delays happened. Everyone knew that. The mountains were difficult in winter, and the railroad company had dealt with snowfall before. The train would come through eventually. It always did. Aldrich Prentice was less sanguine than most. He stood in his mercantile on the morning of December 4th, surveying his inventory with the practiced eye of a man who understood exactly what he had and exactly how long it would last. The flour supply was adequate for perhaps 6 weeks if consumption continued at the normal rate. The salt pork would last about the same. Sugar was shorter, maybe a month, and coffee, perhaps 3 weeks. Tinned goods were in reasonable supply. Dried beans and cornmeal would stretch further than most items. Overall, he calculated the town could survive until mid-January without serious hardship, assuming the train arrived within the next few weeks. And it would arrive. It always did. On the hillside above town, Lenora Hestwood watched the snow fall and said nothing. She had known this was coming. Not the specific details, not the exact timing, but the general shape of it. The early rains, the building clouds, the particular quality of cold in the autumn air. Her mother's wisdom, passed down through generations of women who had learned to read the weather the way scholars read books. When the rains come early, the snows come heavy. The snows had come heavy. Lenora spent the first days of the storm securing her property. She reinforced the roof of her drying shed with additional supports. She stacked firewood on her covered porch until it reached the eaves. She brought Maple inside the main cabin. During the worst of the blizzard, the mare standing patient and calm by the hearth, while the wind howled outside. She checked her storage cellar daily, running her hands over the sealed boxes, reviewing her ledger, calculating and recalculating the mathematics of survival. 512 pounds of dried fruit. Enough, more than enough. She did not go down to the town during the storm. The hillside was too treacherous, the path too buried, the risk too great. But she watched from her porch during the brief breaks in the weather, looking down at the valley where Deerfield huddled beneath its blanket of white. She wondered how long it would take them to understand. The supply train that was supposed to arrive on December 17th did not arrive. Now the concern began to spread. Two missed trains was not a delay. Two missed trains was a pattern. Two missed trains meant that something had gone seriously wrong with the railroad's ability to reach Deerfield, and no one knew when it would be fixed. Aldrich Prentice called a meeting at the church on December 18th. Every adult in town attended, filling the pews and lining the walls, their faces tight with the beginning of worry. "I want to be clear about our situation," Prentice announced from the pulpit, having claimed the position of authority without anyone's explicit agreement. "We have supplies. We are not in immediate danger. But we need to begin managing our resources carefully until the railroad resumes service." "When will that be?" someone called from the back. "I've sent a rider to the telegraph station at Miller's Creek. We should have word within a few days about the railroad's plans." "What if the rider can't get through?" Prentice hesitated. The question had occurred to him, but he had not wanted to address it publicly. "The rider will get through," he said firmly. "The main roads are passable with effort. We're not completely cut off. We're simply, temporarily inconvenienced." The word hung in the air. Inconvenienced. It was such a small word for what they were beginning to fear. "In the meantime," Prentice continued, "I will be implementing rationing at the mercantile. Flour purchases will be limited to 10 pounds per family per week, sugar to 2 pounds, coffee to 1 pound. This is a precaution, nothing more. When the train arrives, normal commerce will resume." The meeting ended with murmured assurances and forced optimism. The train would come. It always did. The rider Prentice had sent to Miller's Creek returned on December 23rd. He had not reached the telegraph station. The road, he reported, was impassable beyond the first ridge. Drifts 20 feet deep blocked every route west. He had tried 3 different paths, each one ending in walls of snow that no horse could navigate. The passes were sealed. The railroad was buried. Miller's Creek might as well have been on the moon. Deerfield was cut off. Completely, absolutely cut off. Prentice received this news in his mercantile, standing behind the counter where he had conducted business for 8 years. His face, normally ruddy with confidence, had gone pale. "How long?" he asked the rider. "How long until the pass is clear?" The rider, a young man named Garrett, who had lived in mountain country all his life, shook his head. "Spring," he said. "Maybe late March if we're lucky. Could be April. Could be later. Depends on how much more snow falls and how fast it melts when the warm weather comes." "Spring," Prentice repeated. "That's 3 months. 4 months." "Yes, sir." Prentice looked at his shelves, looked at his ledgers, calculated the mathematics that he had been avoiding since the first train failed to arrive. 6 weeks of flour at normal consumption. Less with rationing, but rationing only stretched supplies so far. The human body required a certain number of calories to survive, and no amount of economizing could change that fundamental equation. 3 months. 4 months. He did not have enough. Christmas Day in Deerfield was a muted affair. Families gathered as they always did, exchanging small gifts and sharing meals that were notably smaller than in years past. The rationing had already begun to bite. Flour was precious now. Bread a luxury, the elaborate holiday dishes that normally graced the tables of the prosperous reduced to simpler fare. But there was still hope. The territorial governor had been informed of their situation, Prentice announced. A rider had managed to get a message through to a settlement 30 miles east, which had telegraph access to Portland. Help was being organized. An emergency supply train would be dispatched as soon as the passes could be cleared. It was a lie. Prentice knew it was a lie even as he spoke the words. The rider had gotten through to nothing, had reached, no one had accomplished nothing except confirming that Deerfield was utterly alone. But what was he supposed to tell them? That they were stranded, that help was not coming, that the supplies in his mercantile were all that stood between them and starvation. Some lies were necessary. Some lies were mercy. The supply train that was supposed to arrive on December 31st, carrying the holiday provisions that families had ordered weeks in advance, did not arrive. 3 missed trains. The hope that Prentice had carefully cultivated began to crack. People stopped asking when the train would come. They started asking different questions. How much flour remained at the mercantile? How long could the rationing continue? What would happen when the supplies ran out entirely? Prentice raised his prices, not gradually but brutally, the way a man raises a weapon when he feels threatened. Flour went from $2 a sack to 5, then to 8, then to 12. Each increase was justified by the same logic: limited supply, uncertain future, the need to ensure that resources lasted until help arrived. The effect was immediate and devastating. Families who had been living comfortably discovered that comfortable was a temporary condition entirely dependent on circumstances they could not control. The money they had saved, the credit they had built, the security they had taken for granted, all of it evaporated in the face of Prentice's new prices. The wealthy could still eat. The Burke family, with Cornelius's mill profits padding their accounts, could afford $12 for flour without serious hardship. But the working families, the loggers and mill hands and laborers who lived paycheck to paycheck, watched their savings disappear in a matter of weeks. And when the savings were gone, they discovered what Prentice already knew. He would not extend credit. Not now. Not with the supplies running low, and the train not coming, and the mathematics of survival growing darker by the day. "I'm sorry," he told them one after another as they stood before his counter with empty hands and desperate eyes. "I cannot sell what I do not have. I cannot give what must be preserved for those who can pay." The faces he turned away stayed with him, the mothers with hungry children, the old men who had worked their entire lives and now could not afford bread, the proud laborers reduced to begging. He turned them all away. What choice did he have? January arrived with more snow and less hope. The drifts had grown so deep that walking through town required tunnels carved through the accumulation. The streets of Deerfield had become canyons of white, their walls higher than a man's head, the sky visible only as a narrow strip overhead. The mercantile shelves, once groaning with abundance, showed increasing gaps where goods had been sold and not replaced. First, the flour ran out. Always the flour, because it was the foundation of every frontier kitchen, the ingredient without which bread and biscuits and gravy and a dozen other staples could not be made. When the last sack was sold at a price of $15 to a wealthy family from the Mill District, Prentice closed that section of his store and moved the remaining goods forward to fill the empty space. Then the sugar disappeared. Then the coffee, which the loggers and mill workers depended upon the way a preacher depends upon Scripture. Then the salt pork and the tinned goods and the dried beans, until the shelves that had once displayed the bounty of civilization stood as bare and accusing as a guilty conscience. Prentice stopped opening the store daily. There was nothing left to sell. The building that had been the commercial heart of Deerfield became a monument to failure. Its windows dark, its door locked, its emptiness, a constant reminder of how quickly abundance could become scarcity. The hunger set in during February. Not the dramatic starvation of a besieged city, but the slow grinding deprivation of a community that was simply running out. Meals shrank from 3 a day to 2, then to 1. Mothers fed their children and ate nothing themselves, watching with hollow eyes as the little food they had disappeared into mouths that should have been full bellies, that should have been satisfied. The elderly, as they so often did in times of hardship, suffered in silence. They refused larger portions, claiming they weren't hungry. They gave their food to grandchildren, saying they had already eaten. They died quietly in their beds, unwilling to burden their families with the inconvenience of their need. The children were the hardest to watch. Children do not understand rationing. They do not understand why there is no more bread, why dinner is smaller than lunch, why their mothers cry when they ask for seconds. They only understand the gnawing in their bellies, the weakness in their limbs, the terrible confusion of wanting something that the adults cannot provide. The children of Deerfield grew thin. Their faces lost their roundness, revealing the bones beneath. Their eyes grew large in their shrunken faces, watching everything with a hunger that went beyond food. Their laughter disappeared from the streets, replaced by a silence that was worse than crying. On the hillside above town, Lenora Hestwood watched and waited. She made the journey down to Deerfield once during the early weeks of January, struggling through waist-deep snow to reach the main street. She wanted to see for herself what was happening, to confirm what she already suspected. What she found was worse than she had imagined. The town that had mocked her, the town that had called her mad, the town that had whispered about her shed full of fruit that would rot, was dying. She saw it in the faces she passed on the street. The gauntness, the desperation, the particular look of people who have begun to lose hope. She saw it in the closed mercantile, its windows dark and accusing. She saw it in the children who stared at her from doorways, their eyes too large, their bodies too small. She also saw something else. She saw Aldrich Prentice standing outside his empty store watching her with an expression she could not read. She saw Cornelius Boggs hurrying past with his head down, refusing to meet her eyes. She saw Lucretia Boggs peering from behind a curtain, her face pale and frightened. They did not mock her now. They did not call her mad. They did not speak to her at all. But she knew what they were thinking. She could see it in their eyes in the way they looked at her and then looked away. They were remembering the shed. They were remembering the 500 pounds of fruit that they had laughed about, joked about, used as proof of her insanity. They were remembering and they were ashamed. Lenore returned to her hillside without speaking to anyone. She was not ready yet. The time was not right. But soon, the first death came on February 9th. Old Garfield Jessup had worked the timber camps for 40 years before his knees gave out and forced him into retirement. He lived alone in a small cabin on the edge of town, a proud man who had never asked anyone for anything and was not about to start now. When the supplies ran short, he stopped eating. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just a gradual reduction that he hid from his neighbors with the skill of a man who had always kept his troubles to himself. He told them he was fine. He told them he had provisions. He told them not to worry about an old man who had survived worse than a little snow. They believed him because they wanted to believe him. They had their own families to worry about, their own children to feed, their own survival to manage. Old Garfield said he was fine, so he must be fine. That was easier than asking questions that might require difficult answers. They found him on the morning of February 10th. His cabin was warm. The fire in his hearth was still burning, fed by wood that he had stacked so carefully against exactly this kind of winter. His larder was empty, stripped clean of everything edible weeks ago. His woodpile was full because heating the cabin required no supplies from town. He had died warm and starved. The combination struck those who found him as particularly cruel. All that wood, all that heat, all that careful preparation for winter. And none of it mattered because you cannot burn your way out of hunger. They buried him in frozen ground, chipping through snow and ice to reach soil that fought every stroke of the shovel. The grave was shallow, the ceremony was brief. The minister spoke words about God's mercy and the hope of resurrection, words that felt hollow in the bitter cold. Old Garfield Jessup had survived 40 years in the timber camps. He had not survived a winter without a supply train. The second death came 4 days later, and it was worse. The Hollis family had come to Deerfield 3 years earlier, drawn by the promise of work at the mill. They had 2 children, a boy of 7 named William and a girl of 2 named Clara. Clara had been failing since January. She had caught a cold in early December, the kind of minor illness that would normally pass within a week. But her small body, weakened by insufficient food, could not fight off the infection. The cold settled in her chest and refused to leave. Her breathing grew labored. Her fever spiked and would not come down. Her mother, Anna Hollis, did everything she could. She gave Clara the largest portions of what little food they had. She kept the child wrapped in blankets warmed by the fire. She sang to her through the long nights when Clara's coughing made sleep impossible. But Anna could not give what she did not have: medicine, nourishing food, the reserves of strength that a child needs to fight off illness. Clara Hollis died on a Tuesday night in February while her mother held her and sang a lullaby about a beautiful land where the fruit trees never stopped bearing and no one ever went hungry. She was 2 years old. She weighed less when she died than she had weighed on her first birthday. The deaths changed something in Deerfield. Before, the hardship had been an inconvenience, a trial to be endured, a story they would tell when the supply train finally arrived and normal life resumed. After, it became something else: a threat, a presence, a shadow that had entered their town and taken up residence, waiting for its next opportunity. People stopped making promises about when things would get better. They stopped reassuring each other that help was coming. They stopped pretending that this was temporary. They started counting the days since the last train, counting the supplies remaining in their cupboards, counting the faces at church and noting the ones that had grown too thin, too pale, too tired. They started preparing for the worst in whatever small ways they could, and some of them started remembering. The whispers began on February 15th. Not public discussion, not official meetings, just quiet conversations in corners and doorways, voices lowered to avoid being overheard. The widow on the hill. 500 pounds, they said. Do you think she still has it? Dried fruit it was, apples and pears and such. Would it still be good? After all this time, she knew how to preserve things. That was what the old-timers said, learned it from her mother. But she's not. She wouldn't just let us starve, would she? We called her mad. We called her Shed the Madhouse. We all laughed. Do you think she remembers? She remembers everything. The whispers spread through Deerfield like fire through dry brush. The widow, the shed, the 500 pounds of fruit that everyone had mocked. The memory of their cruelty, the shame of their mockery, the terrible irony of their situation. They had laughed at a woman for preparing. Now they were dying because they had not. On the hillside above Tournon, Lenora Hestwood made her decision. She had been waiting for this moment, though she had not known exactly when it would come. Waiting for the mathematics of survival to become undeniable. Waiting for the pride that had sustained their mockery to give way to the desperation that would accept her help. She had not wanted anyone to die. She had hoped that the trains would return before it came to that help would arrive from the outside, that she would be proven wrong about the severity of the winter. But she had not been wrong. She was rarely wrong about such things. Her mother had taught her too well. News of the deaths reached her through one of the Hill families who still visited her cabin, bringing dried venison to trade for berry cakes. They told her about old Garfield Jessup, about little Clara Hollis, about the growing desperation in the town below. Lenora listened without interrupting. When they finished, she stood and walked to her storage cellar. It's time, she said. The morning of February 16th dawned cold and clear, the first break in the weather in nearly a week. The sun rose over the Cascade foothills and struck the hillside east of town, lighting the snow with a brilliance that was almost painful to look at. Lenora Hestwood rose before dawn. She dressed in her warmest clothes, layering wool and cotton and leather until she moved stiffly, but would not freeze. She fed Maple an extra portion of oats and brushed the mare's coat until it gleamed in the lamplight. Then she went to her storage cellar and began loading the sledge. 100 pounds of dried fruit, apples sliced thin and dried to leather, still supple after 3 years of proper storage. Pears halved and honeyed, their sweetness preserved perfectly. Prunes dense with concentrated nourishment. Cherries like jewels in their cloth sacks. Berry cakes wrapped in wax cloth, each one containing enough sustenance for a day of labor. She loaded the sledge methodically, distributing the weight evenly so Maple could haul it down the treacherous hillside without losing her footing. She checked the ropes twice, 3 times, making certain that nothing would shift or fall during the descent. When the sledge was loaded, she stood beside it and looked down at the valley. Deerfield lay below her, small and fragile in the early morning light. The smoke rose from chimneys. The snow lay thick on every surface. The people were stirring, beginning another day of hunger and fear and dwindling hope. They had called her mad. They had called her Shed the Madhouse. They had laughed at her preparations, mocked her abundance, used her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of grief and loneliness. She remembered all of it. She remembered every cruel word, every condescending smile, every whispered joke at her expense. And she was going to defeat them anyway. Lenora led Maple down the hillside, picking her way through the drifts with the careful patience of a woman who understood that haste kills more surely than caution. The path that was treacherous in summer had become nearly impassable in winter, buried under snow and ice, slippery with hidden obstacles. It took her 2 hours to reach the valley floor. By the time she arrived at the edge of town, the sun was fully up, and people were moving through the snow tunnels that served as streets. They saw her coming. Word spread quickly through the confined corridors of the buried town. The widow. The widow was coming down from her hill. The widow had a sledge. The sledge was loaded with something. By the time Lenora reached the main street, a crowd had gathered. Not the mocking crowd of 3 years ago, not the skeptical shoppers who had turned away from her sample of dried apples. This was a different crowd. Desperate, hopeful, afraid. They stood in silence as she approached, their breath making clouds in the cold air, their eyes fixed on the loaded sledge behind her mare. Lenora stopped in front of the building that had once been Aldrich Prentice's mercantile. The same spot where he had refused to let her sell. The same spot where he had told her that people wanted proper goods from proper companies. She tied Maple's reins to a post and began unloading the sledge, setting up a makeshift table of planks and sawhorses. She arranged her goods with the same care she brought to everything, organizing the sacks and boxes by type, making certain that everything was visible and accessible. When she was finished, she turned to face the crowd. "The fruit is free," she said. "Take what you need. Come back tomorrow for more." For a long moment, no one moved. They stared at her at the table, at the abundance that they had mocked for 3 years and desperately needed now. The shame was palpable, a weight in the cold air pressing down on them. Then a boy stepped forward. He was perhaps 10 years old, his face gaunt beneath a wool cap that was too large for his shrunken head. His eyes held both hunger and disbelief, as if he had stumbled upon something that could not possibly exist. He looked at Lenora. She nodded. He grabbed a double handful of dried apple rings and ran. The crowd broke. They came forward in a rush, not pushing or shoving, but pressing close with the urgency of people who had forgotten what abundance looked like. Mothers with children balanced on their hips. Loggers with the shame of hungry men on their weathered faces. The elderly, supported by younger arms, moving slowly through the cold toward a table piled with sweetness. Lenora distributed her stores with calm efficiency. She measured portions by family size, ensuring that each household received enough to last a week. She showed them how to reconstitute the dried fruit in warm water, how to simmer it into a thick compote that stretched further and satisfied longer than eating it dry. She demonstrated her berry cakes, explaining that a single cake the size of a man's palm contained enough nourishment for a day of labor. She answered their questions patiently, without reproach, without reference to the mockery that had preceded this moment. And when the day's supply was gone, she promised to return tomorrow with more. That night, in cabins throughout Deerfield, families ate their first full meal in weeks. Children who had grown thin and listless revived at the taste of sweetness, their eyes brightening, their strength returning. Adults who had given up their portions to feed the young ate dried pears and prunes and felt energy flowing back into bodies that had begun to fail. The dried fruit was more sustaining than anyone had expected. Dense with sugar and fiber and the concentrated essence of summer, it provided nourishment that seemed out of proportion to its volume. A handful of dried cherries could sustain a child through a day. A few berry cakes could keep a working man on his feet. It was not a feast, but it was not starvation. And for now, that was enough. Lenora returned the next day with another 100 pounds, and the next day, and the next. For 5 weeks, she rose before dawn, loaded her sledge, and made the treacherous journey down the hillside to feed the town that had called her mad. She distributed her stores with the same calm efficiency, never rushing, never showing frustration, never reminding anyone of what they had said about her. She supplemented the fruit with whatever else she had. Dried venison from the hill families who still traded with her, potatoes from her root cellar carefully rationed to last through the winter, eggs from her 3 chickens, which had continued to lay throughout the cold months in their snug coop beside the cabin. The effect on Deerfield was transformative. Children who had grown gaunt and weak regained their color within days. Adults who had begun to despair found their strength returning, their hope rekindling. The terrible silence that had settled over the town, the silence of people conserving energy because they did not know when they would eat again, gradually gave way to the ordinary sounds of life. Conversation returned. Laughter returned. The town that had been dying began to live again. Aldrich Prentice watched from the window of his empty mercantile. Day after day, he stood behind the glass and watched the widow distribute her abundance from the very spot where he had refused to let her sell. He watched the people of Deerfield line up to receive what he could not provide, what he had never thought to store, what he had mocked as the product of a deranged mind. The shame was unbearable. He had built his entire life on the principle that commerce was king, that the man who controlled the flow of goods controlled the community. He had positioned himself as the essential link between Deerfield and the wider world, the provider whose shelves ensured that everyone had what they needed. And now his shelves were empty. His store was dark. His role in the community had been revealed as fragile, dependent on a supply chain that could be severed by nothing more than weather. While a widow with a shed full of dried fruit fed the town. Cornelius Boggs watched as well. His mill had shut down in January. No supplies meant no market, no workers meant no production meant no profit. The fortune he had built over 2 decades of labor was irrelevant now. Money could not buy what did not exist. His workers, the men he had employed and commanded, and occasionally mocked for their simplicity, were among those lining up at Lenore's table. They received their portions with gratitude, with relief, with the humble acceptance of people who had learned that pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. Lucretia Boggs watched from behind her curtain. The woman she had called mad. The woman whose enterprise she had declared unwholesome and eccentric. The woman she had organized the respectable women of Deerfield to shun. That woman was saving her life. The realization was acid in her throat. She had been wrong. Not just mistaken, not just hasty in her judgment, but fundamentally, completely devastatingly wrong. She had used her social position to harm an innocent woman, and that woman had responded by offering salvation. On a Wednesday morning in late February, Lucretia Boggs put on her best dress, walked to Lenore's table, and joined the line. She kept her eyes on the ground. She could not bring herself to look up. When she reached the front of the line, Lenora handed her a bag of dried pears without comment, without reproach, without any acknowledgement of the history between them. "Soak them overnight," Lenora said. "They'll be soft by morning." Lucretia nodded. Her throat was too tight for words. She took the pears and walked away, and she did not stop crying until she reached her home. March came slowly, reluctantly, as if the winter was unwilling to release its grip on the mountains. The days grew marginally longer, the sun marginally warmer, but the snow remained deep in the passes, and the railroad remained buried. The emergency supply train that the territorial governor had promised in January had not arrived. It would not arrive. The governor's promises, like the railroad company's schedules, had proven to be words without substance. Plans made in Portland by men who had never spent a winter in the Cascades, commitments that could not survive contact with 30 feet of snow. But Deerfield was no longer dying. Lenora's stores held out. 512 pounds of dried fruit distributed over 5 weeks to 260 people had proven to be exactly enough. Not abundant, not luxurious, but sufficient. The mathematics of survival, which had seemed so dire in January, had shifted to something more hopeful. The fruit was almost gone now. The storage cellar that had held 3 years of labor was nearly empty. But the town had survived. And on the morning of March 9th, 84 days after the last supply train had departed, a sound echoed through the valley that the people of Deerfield had begun to believe they would never hear again. A train whistle, distant at first, then growing closer. The snow in the passes had finally melted enough for the locomotives to break through. The supply train had arrived. The celebration that followed the train's arrival was muted by what had preceded it. Yes, there was relief. Yes, there was joy. Yes, there were tears of gratitude as the supplies were unloaded and distributed, as flour and coffee and sugar and all the ordinary goods of civilization flowed back into the town that had gone without them for so long. But there was also reckoning. Everyone knew what had happened. Everyone knew who had saved them. Everyone knew what they had said about her, how they had treated her, how wrong they had been. The mockery that had seemed so clever 3 years ago hung over them now like a judgment. The madhouse had not been madness. It had been wisdom, and they had laughed at it. On the hillside above town, Lenora Hestwood heard the train whistle and allowed herself a small smile. She had done what she set out to do. She had proven what she knew to be true. And now perhaps they would listen. She looked at her empty storage cellar, at the sledge that had carried so many loads down the treacherous hillside, and at Maple standing patiently in her lean-to stable. "Well, old girl," she said, "I suppose there's more work to do." The mare snorted. Summer was coming. The fruit would ripen again. And this time Lenora would not be working alone. The train whistle echoed through the valley on that March morning, and the people of Deerfield wept. They wept in the streets, tears freezing on their cheeks before they could fall. They wept in their homes, clutching children who had grown too thin, holding spouses who had grown too quiet. They wept in the church where the minister led a prayer of thanksgiving that dissolved into collective sobbing before he could finish the second sentence. 96 days. 96 days since the last supply train had departed. 96 days of dwindling hope and empty shelves and the terrible mathematics of survival. 96 days that had aged them all by years that had taught them lessons they would carry to their graves. The locomotive came through the Panschweiz trailing steam in triumph, its cars loaded with flour and coffee and sugar and salt pork and tinned goods, and everything else that Deerfield had been denied. The railroad company had sent extra provisions, aware that the town had been cut off longer than any community in the territory's history. There was enough to restock every larder refill, every cupboard, restore the illusion that civilization was permanent and reliable. But the illusion had been shattered. The people unloading those supplies knew something now that they had not known before. They knew that the trains could stop. They knew that the passes could close. They knew that everything they had taken for granted, every assumption about the continuity of their lives, could be swept away by nothing more than weather. They knew that they had survived not because of the railroad, not because of the territorial governor, not because of any institution they had trusted. They had survived because of a 65-year-old widow with a shed full of dried fruit, and they had called her mad. The gathering was called for the following Sunday, held in the church because it was the largest building in town, and because the occasion seemed to demand the gravity of sacred ground. Every surviving resident of Deerfield attended. They filled the pews to capacity and lined the walls 3 deep. They stood in the doorway and crowded onto the front steps, craning to hear what was being said inside. Children who had grown thin during the famine sat beside parents who had given up their own food to keep them alive. The elderly who had survived, fewer now than before, occupied places of honor near the front. The air inside the church was thick with emotion. Shame and gratitude mingled in equal measure, each feeding the other, creating an atmosphere so charged that breathing felt difficult. No one had called this meeting officially. No one had appointed themselves to lead it. The town had simply understood that something needed to happen, that words needed to be spoken, that the weight of what they had done required acknowledgement. Aldrich Prentice asked to speak first. He walked to the front of the assembly with the heavy steps of a man approaching a confession he had been rehearsing for weeks. His red beard, once a symbol of his commercial vigor, had gone gray at the edges during the winter. His small, shrewd eyes, which had missed nothing that might affect his profit margins, were fixed on the floor. He gripped the lectern as if it were the only thing holding him upright. 3 years ago, he began, his voice stripped of its usual confidence, a woman came to my store with a sample of dried fruit and asked to sell it from a table outside my door. The church fell absolutely silent. I refused her, he paused. The silence deepened. I told her that people wanted proper goods from proper companies. I told her that homemade fruit from a hillside shed was beneath the standards of my establishment. I told her that her presence outside my store would give the wrong impression. His voice cracked. My establishment has been empty for 3 months. My shelves have held nothing but dust and shame. The proper goods from proper companies did not arrive because the trains did not run and the passes did not clear, and the promises of the railroad and the government meant nothing against 30 feet of snow. He looked up for the first time, scanning the faces of his neighbors. And the woman I refused, the woman this town called mad, the woman whose shed we named the madhouse and whose preparations we used as proof of her derangement. His beard trembled. That woman fed your families when I could not. She fed my family, though I gave her every reason to let us go hungry. She came down from her hill every day for 5 weeks in cold that would have killed a younger person to distribute provisions that she had spent 3 years preparing while we laughed. He turned to face the back of the church where Lenora Hestwood sat in her usual place alone on the rearmost pew. Mrs. Hestwood, I was wrong. The words hung in the air. I was wrong about your fruit. I was wrong about your methods. I was wrong about you. I am a merchant who had nothing to sell. You were a woman who had everything to give. I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I ask for it nonetheless. He remained standing, facing her, waiting. Lenora said nothing. After a long moment, Prentice bowed his head and returned to his seat. Cornelius Boggs rose next, the mill owner who had laughed until his eyes watered at the idea of 500 pounds of dried fruit could barely meet the eyes of the congregation. He was a smaller man now than he had been before the winter. The bluster that had defined him, the booming voice, and the easy confidence of a man who had never known real hardship had been stripped away by months of helplessness. My wife told her circle that Mrs. Hestwood's operation was unwholesome, he said quietly. She organized the respectable women of this town to shun a widow who had done nothing wrong except prepare for a winter that we all should have seen coming. He shook his head slowly. My wife ate Mrs. Hestwood's pears last month and wept because they tasted like summer, and she had forgotten what summer tasted like. A murmur ran through the congregation. I called her enterprise a sad little project born of a shed little life. His voice dropped even lower. I was describing my own character, not hers. My mill stood silent for 3 months because I had prepared nothing stored, nothing planned, nothing. I trusted the supply train to provide everything my family needed. I trusted the railroad and the government in the comfortable assumption that civilization would always arrive on schedule. He looked toward the back of the church. Mrs. Hestwood did not trust anything except her own hands and her own knowledge. She spent 3 years doing work that I dismissed as madness. And when the test came, her madness saved us all while my sanity proved worthless. He sat down heavily. Others spoke. One by one, the people of Deerfield rose to offer their confessions. The mothers who had fed their children on Lenora's dried fruit spoke of the gratitude they could never adequately express. The loggers whose strength had been sustained through the worst of the famine described the berry cakes that had kept them on their feet when nothing else could. The elderly who had survived against all odds testified to the nourishment that had arrived just in time to save them. And many spoke of their shame. They confessed the jokes they had made, the mockery they had contributed, the way they had used Lenora's preparations as evidence of grief-induced derangement. They admitted that they had crossed the street to avoid her, that they had warned their children to stay away from the crazy woman's hill, that they had participated in creating the isolation that could have broken a weaker person. The confessions lasted for nearly an hour. When they finally subsided, an expectant silence settled over the church. Everyone turned to look at the back pew. Lenora Hestwood stood. She was not a tall woman, but something in the way she held herself straight-backed, clear-eyed, unhurried, gave her a presence that seemed to fill the room. The winter had been hard on her, too. At 65, the daily journeys down the treacherous hillside had taken their toll. Her joints ached. Her hands shook slightly. The months of labor and cold and constant giving had aged her in ways that would not reverse. But her eyes remained sharp. Her voice remained steady. She walked to the front of the church with the measured pace of a woman who had learned long ago that hurrying accomplished nothing. She did not grip the lectern as Prentice had done. She simply stood beside it, her hands folded, her gaze moving slowly across the faces of her neighbors. "My mother taught me to dry fruit," she said simply. Her mother taught her. It was not cleverness or prophecy that filled my shed. It was habit. She paused. The habit of women who understood that summer does not last, that trains do not always run, that the only provision you can truly depend upon is the one you make with your own hands. Her voice was calm, without anger, without accusation. "I did not dry 500 pounds of fruit to prove a point. I dried it because waste offends me." She looked around the church. "Every autumn fruit falls from the trees around this town and rots on the ground. Perfectly good food left to the worms and the weather, while this community trusts its survival to a railroad schedule printed in Portland by men who have never spent a winter here." A few people lowered their eyes. "I am not angry with any of you." The words fell into silence. Mockery is the sound people make when they do not understand something. You did not understand why a woman would spend her days in a shed on a hillside processing fruit that no one wanted to buy, storing provisions that no one could imagine needing. She nodded slowly. "Now you understand." Her gaze moved across the congregation one more time. "And if you wish to learn, I will teach you. The fruit is there for the taking. The sun is free. The knowledge is simple. No family in this valley need ever go hungry again if they are willing to do the work." She turned and walked back to her seat. The church remained silent for a long moment. Then someone began to clap. It was a single pair of hands, at first tentative and unsure. Then another pair joined. Then another. Almost there. The applause swelled until it filled the church, until the walls seemed to shake with it, until the sound became something more than appreciation. It became a promise. The summer of 1889 arrived, with the gradual warming that followed every hard winter, the snow retreating from the valleys first, and then slowly releasing its grip on the passes. The railroad resumed its regular schedule. The mercantile restocked its shelves. The rhythms of commerce and community that had been disrupted for so long gradually returned to normal. But Deerfield was not the same town it had been before the winter. Something had changed. The first sign appeared in late April when Josiah Thorne, a logger who had worked the camps for 20 years, climbed the hill to Lenora's cabin and asked if she would teach him to build a drying shed. She looked at him for a long moment, remembering the winters they had both survived, the hunger they had both witnessed. "Why do you want to learn?" "Well, learn," she asked. "Because I never want to feel that helpless again," he said. "Because I have a wife and 3 children, and I watched them grow thin while I could do nothing. Because you showed us all what preparation looks like, and I was too proud to see it before." Lenora nodded. "Come back tomorrow morning. Bring your tools." The second sign appeared a week later when Martha Hensley, who had lost her infant son to the influenza that swept through the weakened town in February, asked Lenora to teach her the art of preservation. "My boy might have lived if I had known how to store food properly." Martha said, her tone steady despite the grief that would never fully heal. "I will not let another child die because I did not prepare." Lenora looked at the young woman's face, saw the determination there, the hard-won understanding. "Come tomorrow," she said. "We will start with apples." The third sign appeared in May when Aldrich Prentice himself climbed the hill with a proposal. He stood on Lenora's porch, his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on the floorboards. "I want to stock locally produced dried fruit in my store," he said. "Your dried fruit, or fruit prepared by anyone you train. I will pay a fair price and sell at a fair markup. I will display it prominently with a sign that says where it came from and who prepared it." He looked up. "I know this does not undo what I did. I know that no amount of commerce can repair the damage of my mockery. But I thought perhaps this might be a beginning." Lenora considered him for a long moment. "You will pay the producers directly," she said. "Not through your credit system. Cash. Yes. And you will never again suggest that homemade goods are inferior to products with fancy labels from Portland." "No, ma'am. Never again." "Then we have a deal, Mr. Prentice." She extended her hand. He shook it. By the end of summer 11, drying sheds had appeared on the hillsides around Deerfield. Each one was built under Lenora's patient instruction. She showed the builders where to position the walls to catch the morning sun. She explained the angle of the roof that would shed rain without trapping moisture. She demonstrated the spacing of the racks, the tension of the cheesecloth greens, the siding, and placement of the hearth for supplemental heat. And then she taught them to use what they had built. She taught the women and more than a few of the men the art that her mother and grandmother had perfected over generations. She showed them how to select fruit at its peak ripeness when the sugars were highest and the flesh was firm, without being hard. She demonstrated the proper thickness for slicing apples, the technique for coring pears, the gentle handling required for cherries. She explained the drying process in detail, the importance of gentle heat, the danger of rushing, the signs that indicated when fruit was properly dried and when it needed more time, the methods for testing moisture content, for recognizing the supple leather texture that meant the job was done. And she taught them how to store what they had made. The cool, dark cellars that preserved quality, the cloth sacks and sealed boxes that kept out insects and moisture, the labeling system that allowed them to track their inventory to know exactly what they had and how long it had been stored. By autumn, the hillsides around Deerfield were busy with harvest. Families who had never thought to preserve their own food were gathering wild plums and huckleberries and windfall apples with the same intensity that Lenore had shown for years. The abandoned orchards that had been dropping their fruit to rot were now stripped clean by eager hands. The berry patches on the high meadows, which had been the exclusive domain of birds and bears, were harvested so thoroughly that not a single fruit went to waste. The phrase "filling the shed" became common wisdom in Deerfield. It was spoken in conversations about preparation and foresight, about the importance of providing for the future during times of abundance. It was used to describe any kind of sensible planning, any action taken today to protect against tomorrow's uncertainties. When someone asked why a neighbor was working so hard in autumn, the answer was simple: filling the shed. Everyone understood. Lucretia Boggs became one of Lenora's most devoted students. This surprised everyone, including Lucretia herself. She had been the leader of the opposition, the woman who had organized the shunning, the social arbiter, who had declared Lenora's enterprise unwholesome and eccentric. She had done more than anyone, except perhaps her husband, to make Lenora's life in Deerfield difficult. But the winter had broken something in her. Not her spirit exactly. Something else. The certainty that had allowed her to judge others so freely, the confidence that had made her the center of respectable society, the comfortable assumption that she understood the world and her place in it. All of that had crumbled when she stood in line to receive dried pears from the woman she had tried to destroy. She came to Lenora's cabin on a June morning, wearing a simple dress instead of her usual finery, her hands bare of the rings that normally adorn them. "I want to learn," she said, "not because I deserve to be taught, but because I need to understand what I failed to see." Lenora regarded her steadily. "The mockery did not wound me as much as you might think," she said. "I have been mocked before by people with more power and less conscience than you possess. I survived them. I survived you." Lucretia nodded, accepting this without argument. "But I will teach you," Lenora continued, "because the knowledge should not die with me, because every woman who learns to preserve food is one more family that will not starve when the trains stop running, because that matters more than old grudges." Lucretia's eyes filled with tears. "I was wrong about everything," she whispered. "Everything." "Yes," Lenora agreed. "You were." She handed Lucretia a paring knife. "Now let me show you how to core an apple." The friendship that developed between them surprised the entire town. Two women who should have been enemies, separated by history and social position and the memory of cruelty, spending their autumn afternoons together on Lenora's porch, slicing fruit, checking drying racks, watching the valley below fill with the gold and crimson of turning leaves. They talked about many things during those long afternoons. About the winter that had changed everything, about the husbands they had loved and the children they had raised, about the fears that kept them awake at night and the hopes they still harbored despite their years, about the strange path that had brought them from enmity to understanding. Lucretia's dried pears by the end of the second season were declared by Lenora herself to be equal to her own. It was the highest compliment she could give. The years passed as years do. The railroad ran reliably after that terrible winter, the passes cleared on schedule, the supply trains arriving with the regularity that Deerfield had once taken for granted. But no one forgot what had happened. No one returned to the comfortable assumption that civilization would always provide. Every autumn the sheds filled. Every winter the cellars held provisions. Every spring the people of Deerfield emerged from the cold with the quiet confidence of those who knew they could survive whatever came. Aldrich Prentice added a dried fruit section to his mercantile stocked exclusively with locally produced goods. He displayed them prominently with a hand-lettered sign that read, "Deerfield's finest prepared by our own." He charged a fair price and paid his suppliers fairly in return. It was, he admitted to Lenora one afternoon, the most honest business he had ever conducted. Cornelius Boggs never fully recovered from the shame of the winter. He remained a quieter man than he had been before, less quick to mock, more thoughtful in his judgments. His mill prospered again when the lumber trade resumed, but he never again confused wealth with wisdom. The children who had survived the famine grew up with stories of the winter their parents had nearly died and the woman who had saved them. They passed these stories to their own children, who passed them to theirs, until Lenora Hestwood became something larger than a person. She became a legend. Lenora lived on her hillside for another 27 years. She continued drying fruit until her hands could no longer hold the knife, until her eyes could no longer judge the moisture content of a slice of apple, until her legs could no longer carry her to the orchards and berry patches that had sustained her work. Even then, she supervised. She sat on her porch and watched the younger women working her racks, offering advice when asked, correcting technique when necessary, maintaining the standards that her mother and grandmother had taught her so many decades before. Maple died in the winter of 1906 at the remarkable age of 32. They buried her near the drying shed in a spot where the morning sun struck first and lingered longest. Lenora stood beside the grave for a long time, remembering all the loads they had hauled together, all the mornings they had descended the treacherous hillside, all the years of patient companionship. "Thank you, old girl," she said finally. "We did good work." She never got another horse. She no longer needed one. Lenora Hestwood passed away in the spring of 1916 at the age of 93. She died in her sleep in the cabin she had built with her own hands 31 years before. The fire had burned down to embers the way it always did toward morning. The light was just beginning to touch the hillside when her breathing stopped. They found her with a peaceful expression on her face, as if she had simply decided that her work was done. The funeral was the largest Deerfield had ever seen. People came from miles around, some of them traveling for days to pay their respects. Former students came with their children and grandchildren. The descendants of families she had fed during the famine came to honor the woman who had saved their ancestors. Even people who had never met her came drawn by stories that had spread far beyond the valley where they had originated. The minister spoke about faith and providence and the mysterious ways of God. But everyone knew that Lenora Hestwood had not relied on providence. She had relied on herself. She was buried beside Ezra in the cemetery overlooking the valley in a plot that caught the morning sun and held it through the afternoon. The headstone was simple, bearing only her name and dates in a single line that she had requested be carved there. She prepared. The drying shed still stands. The cedar shakes have been replaced 3 times and the racks have been rebuilt twice, but the structure itself is the same one that Lenora built in the autumn of 1885. The walls still allow the air to circulate freely. The roof still keeps the rain off without trapping moisture. The stone hearth at one end still provides supplemental heat on wet autumn days. Every autumn when the fruit comes ripe, women gather there to continue the work that a widow began with nothing but grief and knowledge and the stubborn conviction that summer's bounty should never be wasted. They come from Deerfield and the surrounding farms and the towns that have grown up in the valley over the intervening decades. They come with baskets of apples and pears and plums, with buckets of berries gathered from the high meadows, with the harvest of orchards that their great-grandparents planted. They slice and core and arrange and dry using techniques that have been passed down through 4 generations, now refined and perfected but never fundamentally changed. And they tell stories. They tell their children about the winter of 1888 when the train stopped running and the town nearly starved. They tell them about the widow on the hill who everyone called mad, who everyone mocked and shunned and dismissed. They tell them about the 500 pounds of dried fruit that saved 260 lives. They tell them about the moment when Lenora Hestwood walked down from her hill with a sledge full of abundance and gave it away to people who had given her nothing but cruelty. Why did she do it, the children ask. Why did she help them after they were so mean to her? The women think about this question every time it is asked, and every time they give the same answer. Because she understood something that they didn't. She understood that preparation is not about proving yourself right. It's about making sure that everyone survives, even the people who laughed at you. Above the door of the drying shed in letters carved by a hand that knew more about fruit than about carpentry is an inscription that Lenora placed there in 1890, the year after the famine. The letters have been recut several times as weather wore them down, but they have never been changed. They read, "Summer forgets. The shed remembers." Her mother, Constance, who had carried the knowledge from the hill country of Tennessee, would have recognized every word. Her grandmother, who had learned the art in a time before railroads and supply trains, in the comfortable assumption that civilization would always provide, would have understood the meaning without explanation. And anyone who stands in that doorway today, looking out at the valley where Deerfield has grown into a thriving town, can still feel the presence of the woman who proved that the old ways exist for a reason. The trains run reliably now. The stores are always stocked. The passes stay clear through all but the worst winters. But the sheds still fill every autumn. The cellars still hold their provisions. And the people still remember. Because summer forgets, but the shed remembers. Always. In times of plenty, preservation looks like paranoia. In times of scarcity, it looks like prophecy. Lenora Hestwood never claimed to see the future. She simply understood the past well enough to prepare for it. She understood that winters come. She understood that trains stop. She understood that the only provision you can truly depend upon is the one you make with your own hands. And in the end, that understanding saved not just herself, but an entire community that had done nothing to deserve her mercy. That is the lesson of the widow's harvest. That is the legacy of the woman with the mad shed. That is why more than a century later, the people of Deerfield still fill their sheds every autumn, still store their provisions against the winters to come, still pass down the knowledge that a 62-year-old widow carried with her to a hillside in Oregon where no one believed she belonged. She belonged. She always belonged. She just understood something that took the rest of them a terrible winter to learn. Summer forgets. The shed remembers. And so do we, fam.